The time is at hand.
The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army.
When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order.
But I am telling you right now,
we need a great reset.
And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Babylon the Great is fallen, is fallen.
Welcome to In Dark Places. I'm your Huckleberry, Junebug Fugit. I like to complain about work all the time. Who doesn't? There was a time back in 2005 where I broke out of the retail and grocery store business, and I went to work with this real estate guy. His job posting said he needed an accountant, and I have a bachelor's degree in accounting while working in a grocery store. Go figure. And figured I would try my hand at this accounting gig with the real estate guy. And I went up and I talked to him. I put my application in, whatever, my resume and all that. And I got the job. And I was just a secretary. There was no accounting work whatsoever involved in that. I would sit there and answer the phone for him all day. And it was decent money. I had the weekends off. I had early shifts. But it was a pretty nerve-wracking job because the real estate guy was kind of bipolar. He'd be all happy and stuff one minute. The next minute he's just yelling for no reason. And then he would take me out to lunch every day. That was cool. We would go to either Chinese or Mexican restaurant every day. We would kind of bounce back and forth. And he would pay all my meals, and it was fairly good. And he was going to send me to real estate school to take over his business. He was going to pay for it and everything. It was weird. But he was insane. He was a nut. He'd just constantly yell and stuff for no reason. And try to bite my head off and stuff. And one day I was coming into work. It was like my first or second day on the gig. And I saw the real estate guy parking next to the building. And I just pulled in there beside of him. I was like, well, this looks like a good place to park. I want to park right here. And then he just started yelling at me. He said, no, you can't park there. That's for customers. You have to park in the employee parking. And I just looked at him. Like, no, wait a minute. You're not parked in the employee parking. Why do I have to park in the employee parking? I don't want to walk that far. It's cold outside. He was a strange guy. And I started talking to my old manager at the grocery store, and I was like, dude, I've got to come back. I can't take this guy anymore. And after about 2 or 3 months, I went back to the grocery store, and I've been there ever since. It's been 21 years in all that I've worked there. Pretty sad, really. All except for that little 3-month period back in 2005 when I broke away. In our latest installment of What's the Deal with Florida, did you hear about this news story? Probably not. It's been pretty hush-hush. But on January 2nd, 2024, there was a big alien sighting in a mall in Miami. Aliens. They were like 8 to 10 feet tall, and the shoppers in the mall started shooting at them and stuff, trying to protect themselves. And pretty much the entire police force of Florida came to the scene. And the official story was that there were some kids fighting out in the parking lot at that mall using sticks and hitting each other with sticks. And they needed 200 policemen there on the scene to stop those kids from fighting. Makes you wonder. The story's kind of hot off the press, so hopefully there'll be some witnesses, shoppers at the mall or something, come forward here in the next few days. Fill us in on the aliens. All we know is they were 8 to 10 feet tall, kind of like those that were hanging out in Las Vegas last year, or the ones down in Peru were under attack.
Don't give up on us, baby. We're still worth one more try.
David Soul, beloved Starsky and Hutch actor, dead at 80. David Soul, best known for playing Detective Kenneth Hutchinson on TV's Starsky and Hutch, died on Thursday. He was 80. His wife of 13 years, Helen Snell, shared the news in a statement with People magazine as she described Soul as a beloved husband, father, grandfather, and brother. The actor died yesterday after a valiant battle for life in the loving company of his family. He shared many extraordinary gifts in the world as an actor, singer, storyteller, creative artist, and dear friend, her statement continued. His smile, laughter, and passion for life will be remembered by those lives he has touched. Soul played Detective Kenneth Hutchinson to Paul Michael Glazer's Detective David Starsky in the television series that ran from 1975 to 1979. He and Glazer reprised their roles in the 2004 big screen action comedy remake that starred Owen Wilson as Hutch and Ben Stiller as Starsky. Soul, who appeared in movies including Magnum Force opposite Clint Eastwood in 1973, was also a singer, charting in the US and the UK. His biggest hit, which you just heard, in the US, was the 1976 romantic track Don't Give Up on Us, which hit number 1 on the Billboard charts in the US and Canada, while 1977's Silver Lady hit number 1 on the UK singles chart. Born in Chicago, Soul began his career on stage in the 1960s. He became a founding member of the Firehouse Theater in Minneapolis and toured with the company. He made his first TV appearance on The Merv Griffin Show and Flipper. He also made guest appearances on I Dream of Jeannie, Star Trek, and Gunsmoke before his breakthrough role playing Joshua Bolt on the Western comedy Here Come the Brides. But I remember him best as a terrified vampire hunter in the 1979 Stephen King CBS miniseries Salem's Lot. He is survived by Snell, whom he married in 2010, and his 6 children. And here's a little bit of his number 1 U.S. Billboard number 1 hit.
Don't give up on us, baby. We're still worth one more try. I know we put a last one by, just for the rainy evening. Maybe stars are few. Don't give up on us, I know we can still come through.
This story was sent in by our friend Paul Chadwick, executive in charge. Scientists warn zombie deer disease could spread to humans as cases surge across the U.S. Of course, we need a new lockdown. Story by Alexander Butler. Chronic wasting disease, CWD, which leaves animals drooling, lethargic, stumbling, and with a blank stare. I know some people like that. Has been found in 800 samples of deer, elk, and moose across Wyoming. But experts warned the disease was a slow-moving disease and urged governments to prepare for the possibility of it spreading to humans. The mad cow disease outbreak in Britain provided an example of how overnight things can get crazy when a spillover event happens from, say, livestock to people. CWD researcher Dr. Corey Anderson told The Guardian. Thanks, Guardian.
We're talking about the potential of something similar occurring. No one is saying that it's definitely going to happen, but it's important for people to be prepared. Yeah, they're saying it's going to happen. In the UK, 4.4 million cattle were slaughtered after mad cow disease spread in the 80s and 90s due to bovine being fed infected meat and bone meal. The disease, which is usually fatal for cattle, infects the central nervous system and leaves the animals with aggressive symptoms and a lack of coordination. Since 1995, 178 human deaths have been attributed to the human variant. Oh, please, for crying out loud, we gotta lock down all the stores and the mom and pop shops, but leave Walmart and Amazon and those places open, though. It don't affect them. In 2017, 7,000 to 15,000 CWD-infected animals a year were being consumed by humans, according to the Alliance for Public Wildlife. The figure was expected to rise by 20% annually. In Wisconsin, thousands of people have probably eaten meat from infected deer, Anderson said. CWD is extremely hard to eradicate. Once an environment is infected, it can persist for years in dirt or on surfaces. They just need to stay 6 feet apart. And scientists report it is resistant to disinfectants, formaldehyde, radiation, and incineration at 600 degrees Celsius or 1100 degrees Fahrenheit. It comes after U.S. biotech company Ginkgo Bioworks warned illnesses transmitted from animals to humans could kill 12 times as many people in 2050 than it did in 2020. The company said epidemics caused by zoonotic diseases, known as spillovers, could be more frequent in the future due to climate change. Oh my goodness, climate change. He's everywhere. And deforestation. Between 1963 and 2019, epidemics increased by almost 5% every year, with deaths up by 9% according to the group's research. If these annual rates of increases continue, we would expect the analyzed pathogens to cause 4 times the number of spillover events and 12 times the number of deaths in 2050 than in 2020, he warned. And I'm sure it's got nothing to do with the deer eating vegetation that is covered in barium, strontium, and aluminum that fall to the ground from jets. This week on the show, jolly old haunted London. But first, the Nicolas Cage meltdown of the week.
You're always running off at the mouth. You got a motor mouth. There's a motorboat stuck in your mouth. Just shut up.
Hello, in dark places, individuals. It's your friend Mr. Haunted with a story about the 10 Bells Pub in London. The 10 Bells Pub is an iconic destination that remains important to the darkest moment in East London's history. It has even continually served the public since the mid-18th century. The 10 Bells gets its name from mirroring how many bells the Christ Church across the road held in its tower. Records indicate that the establishment was named the 8 Bells Ale House in 1755 and received a name change in 1788 to the 10 Bells, right around the time the church upgraded their bell system. Just as it remains today, the pub was an extremely popular watering hole in the East End of London during the 1800s. The 10 Bells gained fame during this time for its popularity, though this was to eventually turn to infamy for its association with London's best-known serial killer. At least 2, though likely more, of Jack the Ripper's victims were said to have an association with the 10 Bells pub. Annie Chapman was supposedly sighted drinking at the pub around 5 a.m. Wow, that's early. Surely before the time of her murder. Mary Kelly is also said to... Wait, I'm going to stop right there. Did she start drinking at 5 a.m.? Or is it the end of a really, really, really long night? I don't know. Anyways, Mary Kelly is also said to have frequented the pub and was well known for using the pavement just out front of the 10 Bells as a place to attract clients as a prostitute. I would use something different than pavement, but that's just me. The history of this iconic neighborhood pub has made it a point of interest for many people. It has even managed to gain interest within the paranormal community for supposedly containing a number of spirits. Having such close ties to Jack the Ripper case makes this one of London's spookiest pubs, and it seems only fitting that one of the killer's victims should haunt the 10 Bells. The spirit of Annie Chapman has supposedly been sighted within the pub. She is thought to sit in the exact location she had her final drink before her tragic murder. Murder! It was murder! Further, that's my Quincy impression, by the way. It was murder, Sam! Some have claimed that she is responsible for breaking glasses and stealing from unsuspecting guests. Despite the 10 Bells pub being best known for its ties to the infamous Jack the Ripper, it also has a long history outside of these murders. Not surprisingly, the pub is also said to hold other spirits from these times. Perhaps the most active and commonly cited spirit within the pub is that of an older man many have described as wearing Victorian-era clothing. He is generally cited in the upper floors of the pub where staff were once able to live on site. Previous tenants would report hearing footsteps and laughter outside the room when no one was around. Some were even pushed down the stairs when they went to investigate. The spirit was even known to sneak into beds during the night to the fright of unsuspecting staff members. It is believed that this man might have been a former landlord to the building who was possibly murdered. Another story of interest within the 10 Bells relates to that of a mysterious baby who was possibly murdered within the building. In more recent times, a psychic was brought in to help explain some of the paranormal phenomena occurring. Oh boy, here we go. Supposedly, the psychic refused to enter one of the top rooms of the pub. She was unable to explain quite why, but suggested that something terrible had transpired there, relating to the death of a baby sometime in the 19th century. Years after the psychic incident, a leading Jack the Ripper researcher was allowed to tour around the pub. She was also granted rooftop access to the building, where she would discover something very unsettling. It was here she found a sack that had been deposited in a gap between the floor and a water tank. Upon pulling the sack out and opening it, she found it filled with moldy Victorian-era baby clothes. Very creepy. On closer inspection, they appeared to have been slashed with a knife. Although not much can be concluded from this find, it is interesting to note that the sack was located directly on top of the room where the psychic refused to enter. This leaves many lingering questions about the possible murder of a baby within the 10 Bells pub. The 10 Bells pub is open daily to the public and remains a popular spot for those in Whitechapel, London, to stop for a drink. It is also a point of interest made in most of the Jack the Ripper tours, which operate throughout the area. I think it's time to take the In Dark Places school bus on a field trip.
Two fine products from Swift.
Is Peter Pan calling you? Is Peter Pan calling you? You know you really can taste the fresh Peter Pan taste. Is Peter Pan calling you?
Also from Swift. Did you know there's something better than homemade soup after a snowball fight?
Really?
It's Soup Starter. Homemade soup without the homework. Just add meat, simmer, and serve. Soup Starter. Homemade soup without the homework.
Why am I playing this song right here? Why? Because I'm going to tell you about Highgate Cemetery. Highgate Cemetery is one of the most haunted places in London, and with good reason. In the early 1800s, the city's population topped the 1 million mark, and despite a high death rate, it was still growing. Graves were crammed between shops and outside taverns. Undertakers dressed up as clergymen to perform illegal ceremonies. Many people were buried in shallow graves and quickly covered with lime. The stench and disease were horrific. Parliament decided that 7 private cemeteries would be built in the countryside around London. They were known as the Magnificent Seven. The third cemetery, dated 1839, was Highgate. The architect and builder turned Highgate into an eternal oasis of peace. Everybody who was anybody wanted to be buried there. By 1854, the place was packed, and they had to buy another 20 adjoining acres. By the turn of the 20th century, the cemetery's fortunes waned. World War I decimated the staff, and by the end of World War II, the cemetery had all but been abandoned. In 1960, the gates to Highgate Cemetery were closed. Pristine landscaping became lush jungles, and buildings tumbled in on themselves. Studios used the grounds to shoot horror movies, and then the rumors and rituals began. Stories of men dressed in dark robes practicing dark rituals surfaced. Ghosts and ghouls haunted the alleyways around the graveyard. People reported seeing red-eyed demons staring at them through the fence. And then there was the Highgate vampire. The vampire was said to be a medieval nobleman who practiced black magic in Romania. His coffin was brought from Europe to England in the 18th century, and his cult-like followers bought him a house in the West End. He was buried at the site that eventually became Highgate Cemetery. He slumbered peacefully until, according to reports, Satanists performed a ritual at the cemetery that woke him up. The Highgate vampire is said to be a tall, dark figure that glides through the cemetery. His presence is frequently announced by a sudden drop in temperature. He has also caused clocks and watches to stop. He terrifies all animals in his vicinity, and he's been blamed for scores of dead foxes on the cemetery grounds. The Highgate vampire has a hypnotic stare and bone-chilling effect on all who have encountered him, especially those foolish enough to spend the night in the cemetery. Foolish mortals. The Highgate vampire is just the tip of the supernatural iceberg. The problems with the dead started during Victorian times with exploding coffins. Highgate Cemetery has a series of tombs built for those who wanted to be buried above ground. Regulations at the time required tombs to be encased in lead to prevent miasma leaking out. That's in quotation marks. I don't know what that means. Maybe some gases or something. As the bodies decomposed in their hermetically sealed tombs, the buildup of gases, I was right, caused some coffins to explode. The solution was to drill a small hole in the coffin, place a pipe in it, and then light a match so the gases could burn off hygienically, in quotation marks. Though the cemetery is done burning off gases, there are still problems, including heart-stopping banshee wails. Spectral faces float around the place. A ghostly cyclist wanders the grounds, as does the floating ghost of a nun. Some spirits are such regular visitors that the locals have named them. Today, 170,000 people are buried at Highgate Cemetery in 50,000 graves on 37 acres. Plots are still for sale, subject to government restrictions. It continues to be a popular place for enthusiasts of the occult, paranormal, and vampires. It also hosts the graves of some of the history's most well-known figures, including Karl Marx, Malcolm McLaren, and George Michael. On your London vacation, consider a tour of Highgate Cemetery. Back to you, Mr. Junebug.
For decades, the elegant house in the heart of London's West End was plagued by ghosts, but each haunting seemed to take a new and different form. Frank Smith tells the story. Thanks, Frank. In 1884, the National Observer magazine published a poem by Rudyard Kipling entitled Tomlinson. It told the story of a London society waster whose soul was rejected by the devil on the grounds of mediocrity. But it was the setting of the poem that was calculated to interest the general public. It began, "Now Tomlinson gave up the ghost in his house in Berkeley Square, and a spirit came to his bedside and gripped him by the hair." For the previous 4 decades, Berkeley Square had been synonymous with ghosts. According to popular rumor, the focus of the trouble was number 50, a 4-story townhouse of brick and stone, built in the mid-18th century. For some years it had been the London home of Prime Minister George Canning, but it seemed unlikely that the supernatural disturbances in the house had any connection with his restless spirit. Canning was not particularly ethereal in life, and in any case had breathed his last at Chiswick, some miles away. The general consensus of opinion was that the thing that haunted number 50 was too horrible to describe. It seemed to be more a demon or terrible elemental than an ordinary ghost. Even before Bulwer Lytton used the house as a setting for his famous ghost story, The Haunters and the Haunted, stories abounded of a nameless, slimy thing that slithered up and down the stairs, leaving a foul-smelling, snail-like trail in its wake. One tale, not unlike Bulwer Lytton's, told of 2 sailors who had broken into the empty house to shelter for the night. On the morrow, one was found dead, impaled on the railings in the street below, having leapt from the top story in a frenzy of fear, while his companion was discovered white-haired and mad in the house itself. No matter that no documentary evidence for such remarkable incident existed, the story was firmly believed by society dandies and East End costermongers alike, and for several decades was kept alive by poems, newspapers, and music hall songs. Charles Harper, writing in 1907, remarked that the famous haunted house in Berkeley Square was long one of those things that no country cousin coming up from the province of London on sightseeing bent ever willingly missed. Harry Price investigated the mystery in the 1920s, 2 decades before his mishandling, or worse, of the Borley Rectory case made him an object of suspicion in physical research circles. In the Berkeley Square investigation, he seems to have done a reasonable objective job, without, however, researching any firm conclusions. On the one hand, he said he had discovered some evidence that in the late 18th century, presumably before Prime Minister Canning's tenancy, the house had been headquarters of a gang of forgers and coin clippers who actively encouraged tales of the supernatural in order to disguise the true nature of the bumps in the night that the neighbors heard from time to time. On the other hand, he pointed out that the house had been empty for remarkably long periods, and while empty houses often tend to father ghost stories around themselves, 50 Berkeley Square was one of the most desirable addresses in London. So, why had it been deserted for so long? Perhaps the rumors had some truth after all. Price's final surmise was that number 50 may well have been a target for poltergeist activity. In 1840, he discovered that several of the neighbors had heard a variety of noises coming from the empty premises, including bumps on the stairs, dragging noises, as if heavy furniture were being moved about, trampling footsteps, and, fairly regularly, the jangling of the signal bells below stairs. One of the more headstrong neighbors, weary of the commotion, obtained a key, and as soon as he heard the bells tingling, dashed into the house and down to the kitchen. He found the bells still bouncing on their curled springs, but no other sign of life in the locked house. All this, pointed out Price, fitted exactly with the type of phenomenon described by the Society for Psychical Research as poltergeist activity. The one difference being that poltergeists, and particularly all known cases, center themselves on people. In the course of his investigation, Price had to wade through a great deal of speculative data that rarely gave dates or names. For instance, in the 1870s, the magazine Notes and Queries had launched an investigation into the case, culminating in a long series by the writer W. E. Howlett. The mystery of Berkeley Square still remains a mystery, he wrote. We are in hopes that during the last fortnight a full, final, and satisfactory answer would have been given to our questions, but have been disappointed. The story of the haunted house in the heart of Mayfair can be recapitulated in a few words. The house in Berkeley Square contains at least one room of which the atmosphere is supernaturally fatal to body and mind. A girl saw, heard, or felt such horror in it that she went mad and never recovered sanity enough to tell how or why. A gentleman, a disbeliever in ghosts, dared to sleep in it, and was found a corpse in the middle of the floor after frantically ringing for help in vain. Rumor suggests other cases of the same kind, all ending in death, madness, or both, as a result of sleeping, or trying to sleep, in that room. The very party of walls of the house, when touched, are found saturated with electric horror. It is uninhabited, save by an elderly man and his wife, who act as caretakers, but even these have no access to the room. This is kept locked, the key being in the hands of a mysterious and seemingly nameless person who comes to the house once every 6 months, locks up the elderly couple in the basement, and then unlocks the room and occupies himself in it for hours. In 1881, an anonymous writer, again in Notes and Queries, testified to the truth of the electric party walls story, though he too failed to name names, possibly because the witnesses were society people. The incident in question had taken place at a ball given in 49 Berkeley Square early in the season of 1880. A lady and her partner, said the writer, were sitting against the party wall of number 50 when, on a sudden, she moved from her place and looked around. The gentleman was just going to ask the reason when he felt impelled to do the same. On comparing their impressions, both had felt very cold and fancied that someone was looking over their shoulders from the wall behind. From this, it would appear that stone walls do not a prison make for these uncomfortable ghosts who can project themselves right through them to the great discomfort of the next-door neighbors. The most likely explanation of the origins of number 50's sinister reputation was printed shortly after this account appeared, and differed from most in that it could be verified, at least in part, doubtless because the parties mentioned were dead. According to the writer in Pall Mall magazine, the house had been bought after George Canning's death by a Honorable Miss Curzon, who lived there from time to time until her death in 1859 at the age of 90. It was then leased by her executors to a Mr. Myers, Michael Myers, a well-to-do man about town who was engaged to be married and who spent the next few months of his tenancy redecorating and furnishing, only to have his bride jilt him on the eve of her wedding day. The unfortunate Myers became a reclusive in his new home, developing a curiously Dickensian character, part Scrooge and part Miss Havisham. In 1873, he was prosecuted by Westminster Council for non-payment of rates and refused to answer the summons in person. Despite this, the magistrate gave him time to pay, and was surprisingly lenient with him in his summing up. The house in question is known as a haunted house, and has occasioned a good deal of speculation among the neighbors. Mr. Myers' failure to pay his rates had arisen from eccentricity. The Pall Mall author went on. The disappointment of his rejection is said to have broken his heart and turned his brain. He became morose and solitary, and would never allow a woman to come near him. The miserable man locked himself away in the ill-fated top room of the house, only opening the door for meals to be brought in to him occasionally by a manservant. Generally speaking, he slept during the day, and at night would emerge from his self-imposed exile to wander, candle in hand, around the house that was said to have been the scene of his happiness. Possibly Myers was the mysterious and nameless person alluded to by W.E. Howlett, for he died apparently toward the end of the 1870s. Thus, said the writer in Pall Mall, upon the melancholy wanderings of this poor lunatic was founded that story of the ghost. Those whom so many persons insist on calling mad doctors could tell of hundreds of cases of minds diseased in conduct similar to that of poor Myers. His sister was, it was said, his only relative, and she was too old or great and invalid to interfere. There the story should have ended, but it did not. In 1912, Jessie Middleton, a popular author on the occult, wrote in her gray ghost book that her own research had shown that the ghost was that of a little girl in a Scots kilt. She claimed that the child had either been frightened or starved to death in the fourth floor room
and had been seen playing there from time to time ever since, weeping and wringing her hands in dismay. But Miss Middleton added that another version of the story, echoing the falling sailor tale, held that the girl had not been so young, that her name was Adeline, and that rather than submit to a fate worse than death at the hands of her wicked guardian, she had leapt from the window and been spiked to death on the area railings. As late as 1969, another strand was added to the already tangled skin of the Berkeley Square affair. Mrs. Mary Balfour, a lady of a noble Scottish family, whose letters from society names attested to her apparently remarkable powers of clairvoyance, told a reporter of the only actual ghost that she had seen. In early 1937, she had moved with her maid into a flat in Charles Street, which is adjacent to Berkeley Square, having lived previously in the Highlands of Scotland. It was about the time of New Year, she recalled, and I had come in late when my maid summoned me to the kitchen at the back of the flat. We could see into the back windows of the house, diagonally opposite, and in one of them stood a man in a silver-colored coat and breeches of 18th century cut, wearing a periwig and with a drawn, pale face. He was looking out sadly, not moving. I thought perhaps that he had been to some New Year party in fancy dress, and either had a hangover or some personal trouble. I rebuked the girl for staring at him so. It was only afterward that I discovered that the house was number 50. Believe it or not, I had not until that time heard of the reputation of the house. If Mrs. Balfour had not, many people had, and stories about number 50 Berkeley Square continue to circulate even today. In the early years of the Second World War, the house was taken over by antiquarian booksellers, Maggs Brothers Limited. According to a spokesman in late 1981, they were still getting 3 or 4 calls a month from the tourists seeking the ghosts. Unfortunately, we can tell them nothing. The so-called haunted room is next to the accounts department. None of us has ever seen or heard or felt anything out of the ordinary there. During the war, members of the staff used the room as a dormitory while fire watching, without any discomfort apart from draughts. I can only regretfully suppose that the ghost was exorcised long before our arrival. And with that, we're woefully out of time. Our bill. If you've got a true scary story and you'd like to be a guest on the show, send an email to indarkplacespod@hotmail.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week. God bless.